The rain fell over Baltimore all through that afternoon, relentless and heavy, as though the sky itself carried a sorrow it could not put into words. Damon Kessler stood in silence by the tall window, on the third floor of the mansion, the glass in his hand long since empty. He couldn't remember finishing it. All day, something restless had been stirring in his chest, a vague premonition that a hardened man like him simply could not name. It smoldered, it refused to let go. It had all begun that morning, when Rosie did not come. In 6 years, that woman had never once been absent, never once late, never a single complaint. She had never asked for anything for herself. Each dawn she appeared quietly, before the sun had even risen, working as diligently as a shadow no one bothered to notice. And yet this morning, her place stood empty. And that emptiness, for reasons he could not understand, made something in him ache, probably hiding in some corner. Dodging her work, Priscilla had said, one corner of her lips curling into a cold little smile. You know exactly what kind of woman she is, but Damon knew better. In this vast house, not a single soul worked harder than Rosie. He knew it. And he also knew that, for some reason he had never been able to grasp, Priscilla despised the girl with a hatred that had no root. Yet there was something stranger still. Every time his eyes happened to fall upon Rosie, something odd would stir deep within his chest. Not desire, not curiosity. Something closer to familiarity, as though a part of him still remembered something his mind had forgotten long, long ago. A gust of wind slammed against the window pane, rattling it, and that restless premonition in his chest suddenly broke open into an alarm bell. Damon set the glass down. He couldn't explain it to himself. He only knew that he had to go find her. Right now, half an hour later, his car came to a stop before an old house at the edge of the city, where rows of poor rentals huddled behind the quiet docks. He had never set foot in this place, and yet, strangely, the whole way there his hands had turned at each corner on their own, as though a part of him had known the way home for a very long time. The rain lashed at his shoulders. His expensive shoes sank into the soft mud. He looked up at the small house. The door stood ajar. His eyes darkened. Something was very wrong. He climbed the rotting wooden steps. Rosie? No answer. Only the rain. Damon pushed the door wide open, and that smell reached him first. The sharp, coppery scent that any man from his world would recognize in an instant. Blood. His whole body went rigid. The room beyond was a scene of ruin. A chair lay broken against the wall. The table had been overturned. Shards of shattered dishes scattered across the floor. And on the old wooden boards, dark stains spread in uneven patches. His heart pounded. He rushed inside, and then he saw her, a small figure crumpled beside a fireplace whose flames had long since died. In that moment, the whole world of Damon Kessler seemed to stop turning. Rosie. Her brown hair was tangled. One cheek was swollen and bruised. Her faded work dress was torn at her thin shoulder. She looked as though some heartless soul had struck her, then left her lying alone in this cold little house. A hoarse sound broke from Damon's throat, low and choked, no longer quite the sound of a man. The anger rose in him like a swelling tide. Who had dared to do this? Who had dared? He sank down beside her. The hands that had once made so many men tremble were now trembling themselves as they searched for breath at her throat. There, a pulse, frighteningly faint, but still there, alive. She was still alive, Rosie. His voice cracked, something that had not happened in all these years. Rosie, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered faintly. That was all, and then stillness once more. Damon carefully slid his arms beneath her and lifted her up. She was so light, light enough to make his hardened heart wince with a sudden sorrow. Light as though for a long, long time this woman had never once eaten her fill. He held her close against his chest and hurried out toward the car waiting in the rain. And as he laid her down on the seat, his gaze drifted, by chance, to the small table in the corner of the room. There, leaning against an old picture frame, was a child's clumsy drawing. Young, unsteady pencil strokes had sketched 3 people holding hands beneath the roof of a house, a mother, a little boy, and a tall man, his hair shaded a deep brown with eyes colored gray. Damon stood frozen in the falling rain, because that was the exact color of his own eyes. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so we can walk together through the healing stories still waiting ahead. That afternoon, a few hours before the rain swallowed the entire city, Damon Kessler was still sitting in the vast office, on the highest floor of the building overlooking the harbor. From that glass window, almost an entire corner of Baltimore lay spread beneath his feet. The enormous cranes along the piers, the cargo ships lining up one after another to dock, The silent warehouses that everyone in this city understood, without needing to say it aloud, belonged to the Kessler family. Not a single crate passed through the Eastern Harbor without his permission. Not a single casino downtown opened its doors without paying its share. People called him by many names, but every name came wrapped in fear and reverence. Damon Kessler was the man the whole city wanted to be close to, yet didn't dare look straight in the eye. That afternoon, Silas walked into the room, quiet as always, and placed a thin folder on his desk. Something had happened at the old market north of the harbor, where poor vendors still set up their stalls day after day to make a living. A low-level underling named Bruno, a man who had been taken in less than half a year ago, had used the family name to do the very thing Damon hated most in this world. He had gone from stall to stall, forcing small street vendors to pay an extra fee that no one had ever imposed. An old woman selling bread didn't have enough money, so he overturned her whole cart in the middle of the market and crushed the still warm loaves under his feet against the dirt. Damon finished reading the file. He said nothing. He only closed it very slowly, then placed both hands on the wooden desk. Half an hour later, Bruno was brought before him, still wearing the smug, self-satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just earned merit. He smiled and began explaining that he had only been making the family more feared, that he was tightening control over the area so no one would dare look down on the Kessler name. Damon let him finish, then he stood up. The room fell strangely silent. Everyone present knew what that kind of silence meant. Damon walked around the desk and stopped directly in front of the underling, his eyes so cold that Bruno stopped smiling. "Do you know what I hate most?" he said, his voice not loud at all, and for that very reason even more frightening. "I hate strong men who bully those weaker than themselves. I hate men who borrow my name to crush people who have nothing with which to defend themselves." Bruno stammered something about loyalty. Damon didn't give him the chance to continue. A single slight nod toward Silas, clean and decisive, was enough. Bruno was taken from the room. By the next morning, that name would never be mentioned again in any part of the city, and every dollar he had extorted would be returned directly into the hands of each vendor, along with compensation no one would ever have dared imagine. That was Damon Kessler's principle. He could be ruthless with traitors, cold in every negotiation, powerful enough to make an entire underworld empire lower its head. But there was one line he had never allowed anyone to cross. Those who used strength to trample the weak had no place in his world. People whispered that perhaps because of that, the poor residents of the harbor district, though afraid of him, still felt a quiet gratitude toward him in some wordless, difficult-to-name way. After Silas had disappeared from sight, Damon returned to the window and looked down at the city as it turned a deep, storm-dark gray before the rain. He had everything a man could dream of: power, money, the fear and respect of an entire city. And yet inside his chest there had always been an emptiness nothing could fill, a hollow place he had grown so used to, that he no longer cared to ask himself why it was there. He didn't know that right under his own roof, under the very protection of his power, there was a fragile human being who had been tormented for 6 long years, while he had never once reached out a hand to save her. And that bitter irony, before much longer, would return to tear his heart apart. That same morning, when Damon still knew nothing of the nightmare waiting for him ahead, Rosie Vance had woken before dawn, as she had done for the past 6 years. The small servant's room tucked away in the most hidden corner of the Kessler mansion was cramped and cold, but she had grown so used to it that she no longer recognized the lack for what it was. She tied her brown hair neatly back, put on the faded uniform with frayed threads at the cuffs, then silently began the work of a new day before anyone else in the house had even opened their eyes. Mopping the floors, polishing the marble steps, cleaning rooms so vast that walking through them alone was enough to make her legs ache. She did it all without one complaint, without even a sigh, because she had learned long ago that complaining changed nothing, and only gave people another excuse to hurt her. In this house, Rosie understood her place very clearly. She was the lowest of the low, the shadow anyone could step on and then forget at once. The housekeeper, a dry, hard woman with eyes that were always searching for fault, had never missed a single chance to find some mistake in her. A speck of dust left behind on a shelf, a towel not folded squarely enough, everything became a reason for her to release cruel words. And Priscilla, the woman who was soon to become the mistress of this mansion, was many times more ruthless than that. Every time she passed Rosie, her sharp, cold eyes looked at her as if she were something filthy that didn't deserve to exist. There were days when Priscilla deliberately knocked over a tea tray, just to make her kneel down and wipe everything clean from the beginning. There were days when she threw out insults so vicious that anyone who heard them would have felt their heart tighten. But Rosie only lowered her head, stayed silent, and swallowed it all down, because she had no other choice. How many times, through long sleepless nights, had she asked herself why she didn't simply pack her things, leave this hell, take her child far away, and begin a new life somewhere no one knew her face. But then she would remember the invisible chain binding her in place. 6 years earlier, when she gave birth to Micah in desperate poverty without a penny to her name, it was the Kessler family that had stepped in and paid the enormous hospital bill, a sum she could never earn enough in her lifetime to repay. Back then, she had thought it was kindness. She had naively believed there were still people in this world willing to reach out and save those in distress. But she had been wrong. That money hadn't been a gift. It had been a trap, laid with exquisite care. Later, Priscilla and Damon's powerful mother had used it to tighten their grip on her, turning it into a noose around her neck year after year. They told her plainly that as long as she hadn't repaid that debt, she would have to continue serving in this house, and with the meager wages they gave her, she knew she would never pay it off in an entire lifetime. But the thing that frightened her most wasn't the debt. The thing that made her clench her teeth and lower her head through every humiliation was the cold threat Priscilla had once let fall, that the moment Rosie dared to leave, they would use the family's power to prove that a poor, lowly, indebted, homeless mother like her was completely unfit to raise a child, and they would take Micah out of her arms forever. It was that fear of losing her child that had kept Rosie here, forcing her day after day to bend herself into a silent shadow, burying every longing and every scrap of dignity deep at the bottom of her heart, just so each evening she could return to the little house on the edge of the city and hold the small child who was the only light left in her life. The car tore through the heavy curtain of rain, cutting the night open with its dim yellow headlights, and Damon didn't take his eyes off the small figure lying motionless across the back seat, not even once. He brought Rosie straight to the private hospital the Kessler family had quietly supported for years. A place where the finest doctors were summoned in the middle of the night and didn't dare ask a single question. They rushed her into the emergency room, and Damon remained outside in the cold hallway, his hands clenched so tightly that the veins stood out beneath his skin, his heart tangled in a chaos of emotions he himself couldn't name. While he waited, his gaze fell on her old phone, the one that had slipped from her coat pocket when he carried her into the car. The screen was cracked, the case chipped and worn, its paint peeling in uneven patches. He hesitated for a moment, then picked it up, and the first thing that struck his eyes was the wallpaper on the phone, the radiant face of a little boy grinning under the sunlight. His heart tightened faintly, though he didn't understand why. Following the last few messages, he found her conversation with a woman named Martha, the neighbor who lived next door to the small house on the edge of the city. The hurried lines of text told him that this afternoon, before disaster came crashing down, Rosie had sent her son over and asked the woman to watch him. Without hesitating another second, Damon drove to that address. Martha's house was small but warm, its windows spilling a soft yellow light onto the dark, soaked street. When he knocked, the older woman opened the door with wary eyes, but when he said he had come because something had happened to Rosie, her face immediately went pale with worry. She led him inside, and it was there, in that small kitchen beneath the warm lamp hanging from the ceiling, that Damon saw the boy for the first time in his life. Micah was sitting curled up on a wooden chair by the dining table, both hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The little boy lifted his head to look at the strange man, and in that instant, Damon Kessler's whole world seemed to freeze solid. The slightly tousled dark brown hair after sleep, the small dimple in his chin, and the eyes. Oh, those eyes, a clear gray exactly like the eyes Damon saw in the mirror every morning. Damon forgot how to breathe. He stood there, a man who had once made an entire city bow its head, and yet now he couldn't lift a single footstep, couldn't force out a single word, could only stare at the small face looking up at him, as though he were staring into a mirror reflecting his own childhood. The boy tilted his head, his gaze bewildered and a little shy in the way of a child who had just woken to find a stranger in the house. Then, in a tiny voice, young and clear, he asked, "Who are you, and where is my mommy?" That innocent question pierced straight through Damon's chest like a needle. He opened his mouth, but not a sound came out. How was he supposed to answer, when he himself was already staggering beneath thousands of questions with no answers? He slowly knelt down to the boy's height, forcing out the gentlest smile a hard man like him could manage, and in a deep, hoarse voice that had suddenly become strangely soft, he quietly said that his mommy was being cared for by the doctors, that he was a friend of hers, and that he had come here to make sure the boy was safe. Micah looked at him for a long time with those clear gray eyes, seeming to weigh whether he should trust this unfamiliar man or not, and Damon held his breath as he waited, feeling his long, hardened heart beating in strange, unfamiliar rhythms he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was very late into the night when Damon brought the boy back to the mansion, after reassuring Martha that he would personally take care of everything. Micah had finally fallen asleep in his arms for the entire ride home, his head resting against Damon's chest, his breathing steady with the exhaustion of a worn-out child, and Damon had sat completely still, not daring to move, afraid even the smallest motion might wake that fragile sleep. He had someone prepare a warm guest room, laid the boy down on the soft bed, pulled the blanket up over his shoulders, then stood there in silence, watching him for a very long time. The next morning, when the family's private doctor was called in to examine the boy, something strange happened. That seasoned physician, a man who had witnessed more things in life than most could imagine, and had never once revealed emotion in front of his master, suddenly stopped midway when he lifted his eyes to Micah's face, then turned to look at Damon. He stood frozen for a long while, his gaze moving from one to the other, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, only to hold himself back. The whole room sank into a heavy silence, the kind of silence everyone could feel but no one dared to name. Damon understood what the doctor was thinking, because he himself had been thinking the very same thing all through the night, and hadn't been able to break free of it. The resemblance between him and the boy wasn't some passing trace that could be blamed on chance. It showed itself with frightening clarity, in every feature, in the color of his hair, in the shape of his chin, and most of all in those eyes. A question kept rising in Damon's mind, drilling deeper and deeper with a dull, aching force. Who was this child to him, and why, after only seeing him, had something strange already surged inside his chest, an invisible bond his reason couldn't explain? He gave the doctor a slight signal to leave, and the physician bowed his head and went out quietly, not daring to breathe a word. But the final look he cast toward the boy said everything he didn't dare speak aloud. It was at that very moment that the door swung open, and Priscilla walked in with her usual proud, elegant air. But the instant her eyes touched Micah's face, something flashed very quickly across that beautiful, cold face of hers. For only a heartbeat, Damon caught it, a flicker of shock, a glint of panic she hurried to hide, a brief pallor at the corner of her mouth before she managed to regain her composure. Priscilla quickly forced a stiff smile and asked why he had brought a strange child home, her tone trying to sound indifferent, though there was something strained and unnatural beneath it. She didn't even take one step closer to the boy, but remained standing where she was, her hands lightly clasped together, her eyes constantly slipping away, not daring to look directly into Micah's gray eyes. Damon said nothing. He only watched her in silence, and for the first time in many years, a vague warning bell rang softly somewhere in the depths of his heart. He couldn't point to anything specific. He had no proof in his hands, and he couldn't explain where that feeling had come from. But the instinct of a man who had spent his whole life among schemes and betrayal was telling him that something was terribly wrong with this woman, something she was trying to hide, a truth lurking behind that false calm. The feeling came and vanished in an instant, so faint that he almost told himself he had imagined it. But no matter how hard he tried to push it away, that tiny seed of suspicion had already been planted in silence, and it would never truly disappear. That night, Damon couldn't close his eyes at all. He lay in his vast bedroom, the pale moonlight spilling through the window and drawing faint streaks across the ceiling, and he simply stared up into that darkness, letting the current of his thoughts carry him away. The boy's face kept returning again and again in his mind, those clear gray eyes like an invisible key, trying to unlock some door that had long been sealed deep inside him. And then, in the stillness of the late night, strange things began to rise. They weren't clear memories, only scattered fragments, dim and fleeting, passing so quickly that he couldn't grasp them in time. A woman's face he couldn't make out no matter how hard he tried, only the softness of her features and a warm gaze looking at him with so much tenderness. A bright, clear laugh sounding somewhere very far away. A laugh that made his chest ache with a strange longing for something he didn't even know he had once possessed. Some summer from many years ago, filled with golden sunlight and a feeling of complete happiness he hadn't touched in a very long time. Those images came and went like waves, with no beginning and no end, unclear and unfinished, leaving behind only an aftertaste that was both sweet and painfully impossible to understand. Damon closed his eyes, trying to hold on to them, trying to piece those fragments together into a whole picture. But the harder he tried, the more they dissolved, as if some invisible hand were keeping him from seeing the truth. And it was at that very moment that a thought he had never dared touch all these years suddenly crashed back into him, turning his whole body cold. The accident from back then. 6 years earlier, people had told him he had suffered a serious accident, a violent blow to the head that had left him in a coma for a long time. And when he woke, an entire stretch of his life had vanished from his memory, as if it had never existed. All this time he had accepted that explanation, without once questioning it, because his mother had said so, Priscilla had said so, and everyone around him had said the same. He had believed the emptiness in his memory was simply the consequence of an unfortunate accident. But tonight, for the first time, an aching question began to gnaw at him. If that period of time held nothing worth remembering, why had his heart carried an emptiness no one could fill for all these years? If he truly hadn't lost anything important, why did a strange sense of familiarity rise inside him every time he saw Rosie? And why, after meeting that little boy only once, had such a fierce feeling already surged in his heart? He began to doubt the very past he had always believed was his own. Were the things he had been told truly the truth, or was there something hidden behind that accident, something people had deliberately concealed from him? Damon turned over, his heart crowded with unanswered doubts, and in the mute darkness of the room, he felt as though he were standing before a half-open door, with a truth waiting on the other side that one part of him longed to know, while another part trembled in fear at the thought of what might be lurking beyond it. He didn't know that tonight was only the beginning, that these small cracks in his memory would spread wider and wider, until the entire wall of lies built around him, for the past 6 years, collapsed completely. 2 days later, when the morning sunlight slipped through the white curtains of the hospital room, Rosie finally opened her eyes and woke. In the first instant, all she could feel was a dull ache spreading through her whole body, a heaviness pressing down on every strand of flesh, forcing her to close her eyes again for a long while, before she had enough strength to see everything around her clearly. But the moment her awareness fully returned, a terrible panic suddenly burst open inside her, sweeping away every pain and making her push herself up from the hospital bed even though her body was still weak and broken down. Micah, her child, where was her precious little boy? She tried to force herself to stand, her trembling legs nearly giving way beneath her, her mouth stammering her son's name with the terror of a mother. She couldn't remember what had happened. She could only vaguely feel that something dreadful had come crashing down, and the only thought occupying her mind now was whether her child was safe. It was at that moment that the door opened and Damon walked in. When Rosie's panicked eyes met his tall figure, her whole body suddenly froze. She stood rigid in the middle of the room, one hand gripping the edge of the bed to keep her balance, her eyes wide as she stared at him. But there wasn't even the slightest trace of relief or gratitude in that gaze. Instead, there was vigilance, instinctive fear, and deeper than all of it, a silent wound he couldn't understand. Damon quickly spoke to reassure her that Micah was safe and unharmed, that the boy was being cared for properly and hadn't been hurt at all. Only then did Rosie's shoulders sag slightly, a long, trembling breath escaping from her chest, but she still didn't take her eyes off him. She still kept the distance between them, as if he were a danger she needed to guard against. He stepped one pace closer, and at once she stepped one pace back, her gaze hardening. That gesture made Damon stop short, an indescribable feeling rising in his heart. He had saved her, had brought her here, had worried over her child, and yet why was she looking at him as though he were the one who had caused all this suffering? He tried to speak, asking her who had done such a cruel thing, telling her he would personally demand justice for her, but Rosie only pressed her lips tightly together, turned her face away, and didn't answer a single word. Her silence covered the whole room, heavy and cold, and that very silence tormented Damon more than any accusation could have. If she had screamed, if she had cried, if she had hated him and accused him, perhaps he could have borne it more easily. But she only remained silent, with the silence of someone who had grown too used to no one ever listening to her, the silence of someone who had learned that speaking up would change nothing. He looked at her, at the small woman trying to shrink into herself at the corner of the bed, trying to raise an invisible wall around herself for protection, and a strange remorse rose inside him that he couldn't explain. There was something in that wounded posture, in that silent guardedness, that made his heart twist as though he were the one who had sinned against her, though he couldn't remember what he had done wrong. In the end, Rosie only spoke softly, her voice hoarse and exhausted, asking him to let her see her son and saying nothing else. Damon stood there for a long while, looking into those quiet brown eyes that were hiding an entire deep sea of feelings he had no way to reach. And for the first time in his life, that powerful man felt utterly helpless before the silence of another human being. When she was left alone in the quiet hospital room, Rosie rested her head against the pillow and let the current of memory carry her backward through the years that had passed, years that could make her heart tighten with pain just by thinking of them. 6 years wasn't a short span of time for a mother raising a child alone, forced to shoulder an entire life by herself. She remembered the mornings when she had to wake while the sky was still pitch dark to go to the mansion and work. Then, when night fell, hurry home only to stop by a small eatery where she took an extra dishwashing shift to earn a little more meager money. Her hands, once so soft, had slowly grown calloused and cracked from being soaked in water and used for cleaning day after day. There were nights when she came home feeling as if her whole back might break apart, her legs numb to the point that she could barely feel them. But the moment she saw Micah's sleeping face, every trace of exhaustion inside her seemed to melt away. That child was her only reason for living, the small flame that warmed her through the coldest winters of her life. What she remembered most was a winter night long ago, when Micah was still very small and came down with a dangerously high fever. His forehead burned hot, his whole body went limp, and Rosie held him in her arms all night, her heart twisting with fear. There wasn't a single dollar left in the house, the medicine cabinet was empty, and she had panicked so badly that it felt as if her heart were shattering into pieces. She looked around the shabby little house, searching for anything she could sell, and her eyes stopped on the only thing left that still had a little value, a small silver necklace she had cherished and protected for years like a treasure, the final keepsake from a past she always tried not to think about. Without a moment of hesitation, she took it to a pawn shop in the middle of the night and exchanged it for a little money to buy medicine for her son. When she placed the necklace into the shop owner's hand, her heart ached sharply, but she told herself that no keepsake in this world was more precious than her child's life. That night she stayed awake beside her son's bed, changing warm cloths again and again, softly singing familiar lullabies, and when dawn had just begun to break, Micah's fever finally eased, his breathing becoming steady once more. Rosie broke down crying, her tears full of both relief and exhaustion, collapsing beside him as she silently thanked heaven and earth for not taking away the only light of her life. But there was another pain that lingered longer than poverty and hardship, and that was the times Micah innocently asked her about his father. She still remembered with perfect clarity the time he sat by the windowsill, watching the neighborhood children being carried on their father's shoulders, then turned to ask her where his daddy was and why he didn't have a daddy like the other kids. That innocent question cut softly into her heart like a blade. She had tried to swallow her tears, pulled him tightly into her arms, then, in the gentlest voice she could manage, told him that his father was a very kind and strong man, that his father was in a place very far away, but in his heart he always had his son. She couldn't bear to tell him the truth. She couldn't bear to make such a small, clear, innocent soul carry the bitterness of grown people. She wanted him to grow up believing he was loved, even if that belief had been woven from a lie. And every time she saw Micah smile with trust, wrapping his arms around her neck, and whispering that he loved his mommy more than anyone in the world, Rosie felt her heart grow both warm and endlessly wounded. She had sacrificed everything, had traded away her youth, her dignity, and even the dreams that had once belonged only to her, just so that child could have a home, poor as it was, but always overflowing with love. The cracks in Damon's memory kept gnawing at him night after night, making it impossible for him to go on living in that fog for even one more day. He was a man accustomed to holding every truth in the palm of his hand, accustomed to knowing every move his enemies would make before they even had the chance to act, and yet now his own life had become a riddle he couldn't solve. That feeling of helplessness tormented him more than anything else. One morning he summoned Silas, the loyal associate who had followed him for so many years, the only man in this world filled with betrayal to whom he could entrust his complete faith. He shut the office door firmly, lowered his voice, and gave Silas a task he had never imagined he would one day have to carry out: dig up every file related to his accident from 6 years ago. He wanted to know everything, down to the smallest detail: who had been present at the time, which hospital he had been taken to, and who had cared for him throughout the period when he was in a coma. Silas was briefly surprised by the request, because all these years, his master himself had never shown any concern for what had passed. But when he looked into Damon's resolute eyes, he understood this wasn't a passing curiosity. It was something far more serious. The hidden machine of the Kessler family's power began to move quietly. Doors that had always been closed to ordinary people suddenly opened easily before the Kessler name. Those who held information, those who had once buried secrets, all had to lower their heads when Damon's network reached them. Silas sent people to the hospital from back then, tracing every faint mark still left behind after all this time, and only a few days later, he returned with an unusually grave expression. What he had discovered left even him shaken. Damon's medical records from 6 years ago were still being kept, but something was wrong. Several important pages had been replaced. The handwriting and seals didn't match the rest. The dates showed signs of having been altered, and an entire stage of his treatment seemed to have been deliberately erased or rewritten by someone. This wasn't the ordinary carelessness of paperwork. It was clearly a purposeful intervention, the work of some powerful hand trying to hide the truth behind that accident. As Silas presented everything he had found, Damon sat in silence for a long while, his fingers tightening around the arm of the chair. He had been suspicious, but when that suspicion slowly began to be confirmed by concrete evidence, what he felt inside wasn't satisfaction. It was a cold unease spreading through his entire body. If someone had gone to the trouble of altering his medical records, then whatever they wanted to hide must have been something terrible. And if the accident from back then hadn't simply been an accident, then the past he had believed in all this time might have been nothing more than a carefully constructed curtain of lies. He thought of the emptiness inside him through all these years, thought of the strange familiarity that rose in him whenever he looked at Rosie, thought of Micah's eyes that looked exactly like his own, and an ominous instinct made his heart clench. He ordered Silas to keep digging and not miss a single clue, no matter how small. He needed to know who stood behind all of this, and more important than anything, he needed to know what had been stolen from him over the past 6 years. The closer he came to the truth, the more he felt the ground beneath his feet beginning to tremble, as if everything he had ever believed was about to collapse into ruins. While waiting for Silas to continue following the unfinished clues, Damon felt his heart being urged on by something difficult to resist, an invisible pull drawing him toward the boy staying in the mansion. That afternoon, he set aside all the work weighing on him and quietly went to the room where Micah was playing by himself. He stopped at the doorway and stood silently watching the boy sitting absorbed beside a low table, a colored pencil in his hand, lost in his own small world. There was something in that image that made a tenderness rise in Damon's chest, a feeling he had never known in all his life. When Damon stepped in softly, Micah looked up, and at first the boy seemed somewhat cautious, his clear gray eyes watching him with the uneasiness of a child not yet used to a stranger's presence. Damon understood that, so he didn't rush. He slowly sat down on the small chair beside him, trying to make his tall, intimidating frame seem less frightening. Then in the warmest deep voice he could manage, he gently asked what the boy was drawing. Micah hesitated for a moment, then perhaps sensing the gentleness in this man, he gradually opened up. He showed Damon his colorful pictures, crooked houses, shining suns, bright flowers blooming in his young imagination. Then the boy turned the pages of the sketchbook with its worn edges, and what struck Damon's eyes left him utterly still. Inside that sketchbook, page after page, was the image of a man drawn again and again, more times than he could count. A tall man with hair colored carefully in dark brown, and eyes the boy had always filled in with gray. Damon looked at those clumsy lines, and his heart seemed to stop beating. He softly asked the boy who the man in the drawing was, trying to keep his voice from trembling. Micah looked up, his eyes lighting with innocent pride, then answered naturally that it was his daddy. The boy told him he had never met his daddy, but his mommy often told him about him, that his daddy was a very tall and strong man, with brown hair and gray eyes, so he kept drawing his daddy the way his mommy described him, so that one day, when his daddy came back, he would recognize him right away. The boy added that he had always dreamed of one day being carried on his daddy's shoulders, of having his daddy hold his hand and take him out to play like the other children, and that he was sure his daddy was somewhere very far away, but would definitely come back to him and his mommy one day. Every innocent word cut into Damon's heart like an invisible blade, leaving him choked and unable to speak. He looked at that small face glowing with hope, looked at the gray eyes so much like his own, looked at the drawings into which the boy had poured all his longing, and a feeling both painful and warm beyond words surged through him. He didn't know the truth for certain. He didn't dare confirm what his heart was already telling him, but the longer he looked at the boy, the more he felt some invisible thread tightening between him and this small living soul, a bond his reason couldn't deny. He gently reached out, hesitantly resting his hand on the boy's soft hair, and Micah not only didn't pull away, but lifted his face and smiled at him, a smile so pure that it made the man who had weathered so many storms in life turn his face aside to hide the sudden sting in his eyes. In that moment, in the room filled with afternoon sunlight, Damon silently promised himself that, no matter what the truth might be, he would never let this child be disappointed. Only a few days later, Silas returned to Damon with a new folder of documents, and this time his expression was far heavier than before. Through the dense network of eyes and ears, he had traced the truth behind the fateful night when Rosie was attacked, and what he uncovered was enough to make even a calm man like him feel outraged. It turned out that the attack hadn't been a random disaster at all, as people might have thought. Silas had tracked down the man who carried it out, a thug hired from outside, and by following the money trail along with the suspicious phone calls, every clue eventually led back to one name: Priscilla. The story was gradually pieced together into a picture so clear it sent a chill down the spine. A few days before disaster struck, while quietly working in the mansion as usual, Rosie had accidentally passed by a room and heard a conversation she should never have heard. It was a hushed exchange that revealed part of the secret buried for the past 6 years, a monstrous conspiracy tied directly to Damon and his past. Rosie probably hadn't understood everything, but what she had heard was already enough to make her a danger in Priscilla's eyes. And that cruel woman wasn't someone who would allow any threat to remain. She had decided that Rosie had to be silenced at any cost, that she had to be made silent forever before she had the chance to tell Damon anything. That was why, on that stormy night, when Rosie returned to her small house, disaster came crashing down. When Damon understood all of it, he sat motionless, but inside him, an entire storm was churning violently. He looked down at his own hands, remembering the image of Rosie collapsed in that cold house, remembering how light her small body had felt when he lifted her into his arms, remembering the wounded eyes with which she had looked at him without saying a word. Now he understood why she had looked at him with such caution, why she had built a defensive wall around herself. She had suffered a brutal attack simply because she had accidentally learned a truth, and the person behind it all was the very woman he was about to marry. The woman who lived beneath the same roof with him day after day, the woman who still smiled with noble grace in front of him while her hands were stained with dark schemes. Damon's anger didn't erupt into shouting or destruction. It was colder than that, deeper than that, and far more terrifying. It was the smoldering rage of a great beast that had been deceived, silently sharpening its fangs in the dark. He had spent his entire life punishing those who used strength to bully the weak, had never tolerated anyone who dared trample those without power or protection. And yet now he realized that the cruelest one of all had been hiding right beside him, inside his own home, and her victim was no one else but the woman his heart, though he still didn't understand why, had always ached for whenever he thought of her. He quietly ordered Silas to keep everything secret and not reveal a single thing yet, because he knew that if they alarmed the enemy too soon, she would have the chance to deny everything and destroy the evidence. He needed more time, more proof, and he needed to hold every piece firmly in his hand before he struck. But deep in his heart, he silently promised himself that those who had caused all this suffering, whoever they might be, would one day pay for exactly what they had sown. That night, when Silas brought the final piece, the entire picture of the truth finally appeared before Damon's eyes, complete and merciless. His loyal associate had found a witness from back then, an old maid who had once been driven out of the mansion and bribed into silence, and now, as she neared the end of her life, she had decided to tell everything, and what Damon heard made him stagger as though the ground beneath his feet had just collapsed. 6 years earlier, before the so-called accident happened, he and Rosie had been in love. It hadn't been a passing affair, but a love so deep that he had decided to defy everything to be with her, a poor girl with no status. He had given her a promise of marriage. He had woven so many dreams with her about a home, about a future together. The very silver necklace Rosie had been forced to pawn on the night their son had a fever was the keepsake he had given her back then, the token of their engagement. But their love had become a thorn in the eyes of two ambitious women. His mother, Eleanor, who had always longed to marry her son into the prestigious Hartwell family to strengthen power and wealth, would never accept a poor, lowly girl entering the household. And Priscilla, who had long set her sights on both Damon himself and his enormous fortune, could not possibly allow Rosie to take away what she had already marked as hers. So the two of them joined hands and built a scheme so vicious it chilled the blood. The accident from back then had never been an accident at all. It was an elaborately staged performance meant to make him suffer an injury that would steal away his memory of a period of his life, and most important of all, steal away his memory of Rosie and the love between them. Then, when he woke with an empty mind, they used that weakness, embroidered a false past around him, stuffed his head with lies, and isolated him from everyone who knew the truth. They fired, bribed, and threatened anyone who might reveal what had happened long ago. And crueler than anything, they didn't send Rosie away to some far-off place. Instead, they tormented her right beneath this very roof, turning the woman he had once loved into a lowly servant, forcing her to lower her head and serve before him day after day, while he knew nothing at all. They used the hospital debt to chain her in place. They used her child to threaten her, leaving her unable to speak, unable to leave, able only to endure in silence for 6 long years. And then came the final piece, the piece that made Damon's heart feel as though it were breaking apart. The boy Micah, the child with gray eyes exactly like his own, was his biological son. Rosie had been carrying his blood when disaster struck, and she had given birth alone, raised the child alone for 6 years in the most desperate poverty, while the boy's father lived right beside them without ever knowing his son existed. Damon shot to his feet, his entire body trembling violently. He felt a heartbreak unlike anything he had ever known, regret and rage surging at the same time, drowning him in a storm of emotions he could no longer hold back. 6 years. They had stolen 6 whole years from him. 6 years in which he should have been beside the woman he loved, should have watched his son come into the world, should have heard that first call of Daddy, should have seen his child take his first unsteady steps. Every sacred moment had been stolen from him without mercy, all because of the greed and selfishness of people he had once trusted most. He remembered the nameless emptiness in his chest all these years, and now he understood. It was the hollow left by a love that had been taken from him, by a family that had been torn apart. In the still darkness of that night, the most powerful man in the city broke down, tasting for the first time the pain of someone who had lost everything without ever knowing it. The next morning, Damon went to his mother's private room. He stepped inside with a composure so calm it was frightening, but beneath that stillness was an abyss of pain, waiting to swallow him whole. Eleanor was sitting by the window, taking a sip of her morning tea, and when she saw her son come in with that strange look in his eyes, she faltered slightly. Damon didn't circle around the matter. He looked straight into his mother's eyes, and in a low voice as heavy as stone, he asked whether she knew anything about what had happened 6 years ago. Just that one question, and I saw everything he needed to see. Eleanor's face changed color for an instant, her hands trembled faintly enough to make the tea ripple in its cup, and in that brief moment, he understood that the last of his hopes had shattered. He had secretly wished, even if it was only the thinnest thread of hope, that his mother had been innocent, that she too had been a victim of deception just as he had. But the way her eyes avoided his told him everything. Eleanor set the teacup down, let out a very long sigh, and she didn't deny it. Perhaps that was what hurt Damon most, that his mother didn't even bother to deny it. She only quietly lifted her eyes to look at her son, and in those aging eyes, there was none of the remorse he had longed to see, only the cold hardness of someone who believed she had done the right thing. She began to justify herself, her voice still carrying its familiar, dignified authority. She said everything she had done had been for him, for the future of the Kessler bloodline. She said a man in his position could never be paired with a poor, lowly girl with no name and no standing, that such a thing would have made him a laughingstock among high society and stained the name generations of Kesslers had worked so hard to build. She said the marriage with the Hartwell family was the only path to strengthen power and wealth, to make certain that the empire she had sacrificed her whole life to cultivate would endure forever. In her eyes, Rosie had never been a human being with a heart capable of love and suffering, but only an obstacle that needed to be removed, a mistake that had to be corrected. Damon listened to every word from his mother, and each one that came from her mouth cut deeper into his bleeding heart. He realized that the woman who had given birth to him, who had raised him to adulthood, the woman he had once respected and trusted more than anyone in the world, was the very person who had coldly sold off his happiness in exchange for status and money. She had watched him live through 6 empty years without the slightest stir of pity. She had known he had a flesh and blood son and had still mercilessly hidden it, leaving her own grandson to grow up deprived of a father's love. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smash anything or shout, because this pain had gone far beyond what anger could express. He only stood there, silently looking at his mother with eyes filled with disappointment and grief, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone hoarse. He quietly said that she had lost him, that from this moment on, the mother he had once known no longer existed. After saying that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the woman sitting frozen in the vast room, and with every step he took away from her, some part of his heart closed forever. The part that had once belonged entirely to the sacred love between mother and child, now crushed by her own hands, carrying an entire sea of remorse and pain inside him. Damon came to Rosie's side once she had gradually begun to recover. He stepped into the room, and this time there was no longer the confusion of the previous days in his eyes, but the raw agony of a man who had finally understood everything. He stood before her, the woman he had once loved and lost, and in a choked voice rarely heard from a hard man like him, he began to tell her everything he had discovered. He spoke of the staged accident, of the stolen memories, of his mother's and Priscilla's vicious scheme, of the truth that he had never willingly abandoned her. He said that for the past 6 years he hadn't known anything, that if he had remembered, he would never have allowed her to suffer so much pain. Rosie sat silently and listened, and when he finished, only a heavy stillness remained in the room. She didn't burst into tears, nor did she throw herself into his arms as he perhaps had secretly hoped. She only sat there, her quiet brown eyes lowered to her calloused hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice was strangely calm, the kind of calm belonging to someone who had passed through too much suffering to be easily moved. She said she believed what he had told her, that she understood he too had been only a victim of that scheme, and that she didn't blame him for the things he couldn't control. But then she lifted her eyes and looked straight into his, and in that gaze there was a sorrow so deep, as well as a firmness that left him silent. She said that even if he was innocent in that conspiracy, the truth still hadn't changed. For 6 long years, she had carried everything alone. Alone through pregnancy, alone through childbirth, alone through sleepless nights when their son was sick, alone as she wiped away her tears whenever he asked about his father. No one had been beside her in those darkest moments, and those years, those tears, that loneliness, no explanation could erase them, and no apology could ever give them back to her. She said she wasn't angry with him. But she also couldn't simply open her heart at once just because she now knew the truth. She couldn't pretend those long 6 years had never existed. Damon stood there listening to every word she said, and he realized she was completely right. He had been naive enough to think that as long as he told the truth, as long as he let her know he hadn't been at fault, every wound would begin to heal. But now, facing that small yet resilient woman, he finally understood that some wounds were too deep, some losses too vast, for any apology, no matter how sincere, to ever make up for them. She wasn't a weak woman waiting to be saved, nor was she someone willing to forget everything for a small hope of happiness. She had her own self-respect, a dignity that 6 years of being trampled had never managed to destroy, and that very thing made him ache, while also making him admire her more deeply than ever before. He gave a slight nod, not trying to plead or explain anything further, only quietly saying that he understood, that he didn't expect her to forgive him right away, and that he would spend the rest of his life making up for what had been lost, not with words, but with actions. Then he quietly left, carrying a new resolve in his heart, that he would be patient, that he would wait, that he would prove his heart to her, no matter how long it might take. From the moment Damon learned the whole truth, he changed. The pain and fury inside him were no longer chaotic as they had been in the first days, but had settled, crystallizing into a resolve as sharp and cold as steel. He understood that to punish those who had caused so many sins, he couldn't act on emotion, couldn't let anger lead the way. He had to do it in his own manner, in a way that would leave them no path of retreat, no chance to deny their crimes or destroy the evidence. And that perfect opportunity was drawing very near. The Hartwell family had long arranged a lavish engagement ceremony for him and Priscilla, a grand event that would gather all the noble elite of Baltimore, where the two prestigious families would officially become in-laws before everyone's eyes. Priscilla was still eagerly preparing for that day, certain that every scheme of hers had been flawless, certain that in only a few more days, she would officially place her hands on the Kessler family's wealth and power. She had no idea that the very ceremony she was so anxiously awaiting would become the stage for her own collapse. Damon decided he would expose everything right there, in broad daylight, before all the people whose respect Priscilla and his mother had always longed to possess. He would let their entire world witness the real face hidden behind that elegant layer of powder and lipstick. But he knew very well that public humiliation alone wasn't enough. He needed true justice, the kind of justice the law itself would have to recognize. And so, in the quiet days before the storm, he and Silas silently prepared everything. Every piece of evidence about the assault, every trace of the money used to hire the attacker, every proof that the medical records had been falsified, along with the statements of the witnesses from back then, all of it was collected carefully and arranged so tightly that not a single gap could slip through. He wanted the blow, when it finally fell, to be one from which they could never rise again. And yet, just when everything seemed to be under control, Silas came to him with a warning that made the air suddenly grow tense enough to suffocate. He said Priscilla seemed to have begun to suspect something. She was a sharp and perceptive woman, and in recent days, Damon's attitude toward her had become somehow different, a coldness she couldn't fail to notice. She had dimly sensed that something was wrong, that the secret she had buried all this time might be in danger of being exposed. Silas was worried that once cornered, someone as cruel and ambitious as Priscilla might do something reckless and insane, because she had gambled her entire life on this bet and wouldn't let go easily. Hearing those words, Damon's eyes darkened for a moment. He understood that time was running out, and that the danger now threatened not only his plan, but also the safety of the people he most wanted to protect. He immediately increased the guards around Rosie and little Micah, carefully instructing them not to let mother or child leave their sight, because he knew that if Priscilla truly went mad in her desperation, she might very well aim at the very people she saw as thorns in her eyes. An ominous instinct rose inside him, and he silently told himself he had to act quickly, had to end everything before the enemy could commit any more crimes. The final days before the ceremony passed in a suffocating atmosphere, stretched taut like a violin string about to snap, and both he and Silas knew that the real storm was only a hair's breadth away. On the night of the engagement ceremony, the Hartwell mansion blazed beneath the glow of splendid crystal lights, filled with graceful music and the crisp laughter of Baltimore's upper class. The expensive formal wear, the glittering jewels, the shimmering glasses of wine, all of it created a scene of the highest luxury, the kind the whole city longed to step into even once. Priscilla appeared in a magnificent white gown, her face radiant with pride, moving through the crowd like a queen savoring her triumph. She believed tonight was the pinnacle of her entire life, the moment when all the schemes she had carried for so long would finally bloom and bear fruit. Damon stood there, calm and cold in a dark suit, but hidden behind that composed exterior was a storm waiting to be released. When the officiant solemnly invited him to step forward and make the official declaration, the entire hall fell silent in anticipation. Damon stepped onto the raised platform, swept his eyes once over the noble faces turned toward him, then spoke in a deep, resonant voice, each word clear. But what he said wasn't the promise of a lifetime that everyone had been expecting. He announced that there would be no engagement ceremony tonight. The whole hall was shaken, confused murmurs spreading like waves. Priscilla's face changed color at once, her proud smile freezing in place. Before the stunned eyes of everyone present, Damon signaled to Silas, and one piece of evidence after another was brought out before the public. He exposed the entire scheme from years ago, the staged accident meant to steal his memories, the falsified medical records, the sinister plot to separate him from the woman he loved and seize the Kessler family's fortune. Then he revealed the cruelest crime of all, that Priscilla herself had hired someone to harm an innocent mother just to silence her. Every word he spoke fell like a hammer blow, smashing apart the elegant mask Priscilla had spent so many years carefully painting. The noble crowd turned to look at her with horror and disgust. Priscilla staggered. She tried to deny it, tried to scream that it was all slander, that Damon had gone mad, but the undeniable evidence laid out before everyone's eyes made every excuse from her look absurd and meaningless. She searched the faces of her father, of the powerful members of the Hartwell family, begging for help, but what answered her were only avoiding eyes and cold backs turning away. No one wanted to be tied to such a monstrous scandal. No one wanted to be dragged down by a sinner who had already been exposed. In the blink of an eye, the dazzling world Priscilla had traded her whole soul to possess collapsed into ruins beneath her feet. Damon looked at her, his eyes holding not the slightest trace of mercy. He declared that from this moment on, every bond between him and her was completely severed, and that she would face the law and pay for each crime she had committed. He had prepared everything so thoroughly that the authorities were already waiting outside, ready for this moment. With power and undeniable evidence in his hands, a single word from Damon was enough to decide the fate of the woman who had destroyed his life. Priscilla, the woman who had once walked proudly through the crowd like a queen, now collapsed in the middle of the glittering hall, her face bloodless, her empty eyes staring into the ending she herself had sewn with her own hands. Not a single drop of blood had to be spilled, not a single act of violence had to take place, and yet punishment still fell completely and deservedly, through the very power of truth and justice. And beneath the brilliant lights of that gala night, Damon quietly turned and walked away, leaving behind him the wreckage of an empire of lies that had just fallen apart. But desperate people are always the most dangerous, and Priscilla, driven into a corner as she watched everything collapse, refused to accept defeat in silence. Amid the chaos of the hall, when every eye was fixed on the tragedy unfolding before them, she took advantage of one careless opening and slipped away from the surrounding crowd. In her mind, only one crazed thought remained, that it was that woman, Rosie herself, who was the source of all this ruin, and if she had to lose everything, then she would make the person she hated pay for it too. She knew Rosie was being taken to a safe place according to Damon's arrangements, and in her madness, she found a way to follow. The moment Damon discovered that Priscilla had disappeared from the hall, he immediately understood the danger hanging over them. A cold fear pierced through his heart, and he remembered Silas's warning about the recklessness of someone cornered with no way out. He felt immeasurably fortunate that he had already been careful enough to send little Micah to stay with Martha at her warm, safe house on a quiet street, guarded by trusted people and kept completely far from every danger lying in wait. At least that innocent child would never have to come near the dark shadow of this crime. But Rosie was in danger. Without hesitating for even 1 second, Damon rushed out of the mansion and drove into the night at a frantic speed, his heart pounding under a terror he had never known before. In his mind, The image of that stormy night long ago kept appearing, the night when he had arrived too late, the night when he could only hold her motionless body in his arms and feel helpless. He told himself that this time, no matter what price he had to pay, he wouldn't let that tragedy happen again. When he sped to the place where Rosie was staying, the scene before him made the blood in his body seem to freeze. Priscilla had found her way there, and in a state of extreme agitation, she had cornered Rosie, her eyes blazing with the madness of someone who had lost all reason. Rosie stood there, trembling but still holding her head high, not begging and not submitting, that resilient dignity never leaving her even in the most dangerous moment. Just as Priscilla was about to strike, Damon arrived in time. He stepped between her and Rosie, his firm hand locking around Priscilla's raised wrist, stopping disaster by the narrowest margin. This time, he had made it in time. He was no longer a man arriving too late, able only to hold his pain, but a man who had managed to stretch out his arms in time to shelter the woman he loved. Priscilla struggled and screamed in despair, but how could her strength ever match his? Soon after, Silas and the authorities caught up and burst in. Priscilla was restrained and taken away, her frenzied screams growing smaller and smaller before fading completely into the night, closing the long days of suffering sown by a person swallowed whole by greed and envy. She would have to face punishment under the law and pay for every crime she had committed, a just ending she had brought upon herself. When all danger had passed, Damon turned to Rosie. She still stood there, her shoulders trembling slightly after the horror she had just endured. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with so many things left unspoken, remorse, heartache, and a boundless relief that this time he hadn't come too late. Rosie lifted her eyes to look at him, and for the first time since everything had come to light, the defensive wall in her gaze seemed to waver a little, making room for something fragile and warm that had only just begun to bloom. A few days after the storm had passed, Damon returned to the small house on the edge of the city, the very house where he had found Rosie on that fateful rain-soaked night. Now it had been cleaned and put neatly back in order, but to him, every small corner of this house still seemed to carry the lingering scent of an unhealed pain. He stood at the doorway for a long time before he had enough courage to knock. Rosie opened the door, briefly surprised to see him, but she still silently stepped aside to let him in. The two of them sat facing each other in the small room, held between them by a long silence. Then Damon began to speak. This time he hadn't come to explain or to prove his innocence. He had come to confess. He said that, although the conspiracy hadn't been created by him, although his memories had been stolen, in the end, he had still been absent. He had still been the father who wasn't there when his son was born. He had still been the man who wasn't beside her when she needed him most. He said he wasn't asking her for forgiveness, because he knew there were things that couldn't be forgiven. He only wanted her to know how deeply he regretted it, and that regret would follow him for the rest of his life. Rosie sat listening, her hands resting quietly on her knees. She said nothing for a long while. Then he saw her shoulders begin to tremble faintly. Her tears fell, silently, without a single sob. They weren't the tears of a passing emotion. They were the tears of someone who had held back for too long, who had endured too much, the quiet and heavy tears of a heart that had been wounded for 6 long years. She lifted her eyes to look at him, and softly she said, "I waited." Only those 3 words, and yet they struck straight through Damon's heart like a knife. She went on, her voice small and trembling. She said that through all those years she had waited. Every day she had waited. At first, she had waited for him to come back, believing there had to be some reason he couldn't come yet. Then she waited in doubt, asking herself whether he had forgotten her. Then she waited in despair, painfully thinking that perhaps he had never loved her enough to return. She said there had been nights when she held their son and looked out the window, waiting for a figure that never appeared. There had been times when she heard footsteps outside the door, and her heart leapt with hope, only to sink again into disappointment. She said she had waited until there was nothing left to wait for, waited until her heart had learned how to accept that he would never come. And the most painful thing, she whispered, was that through all those years, she had blamed him, resented him, thought he was a faithless man, while the truth was that he too had only been a victim, just like her. Hearing those words, Damon could no longer hold himself together. A man who had passed through so many storms, who had faced danger without flinching, now felt his eyes sting. He thought of her alone by the window through all those seasons of rain and sun, waiting alone in hopelessness, carrying alone the loneliness he should have shared with her. His heart twisted with tenderness and remorse. He slowly reached out, hesitated, then gently placed his hand over her calloused one. She didn't pull her hand away. In that quiet small house, amid silent tears and confessions drawn from the deepest place in the heart, two people who had once been torn apart by fate were finally sitting beside each other again for the first time after 6 long years, crying together for everything that had been lost, and quietly kindling in their hearts a fragile glimmer of hope for what might still be healed from this moment on. In the weeks that followed, Damon often returned to that small house, but he didn't come as a powerful crime lord who made the whole city tremble with respect and fear. He came as a father timidly learning all over again everything he had missed. He took off his expensive suit, rolled up his sleeves to help Rosie repair the crooked fence, sat right down on the floor to play clumsy children's games with Micah, and listened as she told him about the years when he hadn't been there. She told him about the day Micah took his first unsteady steps, when the little boy fell again and again, but still laughed with bright, bubbling joy. She told him about his first word, not mommy as she had once hoped, but a funny little word he had said while pointing at a bird perched outside the window. She told him about his simple birthdays, with a small cake she had made with her own hands and modest gifts wrapped with all the love she had in her heart. Damon listened to every story, and every story both warmed and choked his heart, because those were precious moments he should have witnessed with them, memories he had lost forever and could never take back. But he didn't let that regret drown him. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could cherish every second of the present. He worked tirelessly to make up for what had been lost, patient and gentle, slowly winning the little boy's trust. Micah, who had been shy and cautious at first, had now begun to cling to him, chattering excitedly as he showed him every new drawing, every small discovery in his childhood world. One afternoon, while the two of them were sitting together on the wooden steps, watching the sun set behind the line of trees, Micah suddenly looked up at him with those clear gray eyes and, in his young voice filled with curiosity, softly asked him, "Uncle, are you my daddy?" That question left Damon completely still. He looked into the small face waiting for an answer, a face carved so much like his own, and he felt his throat close up. He thought of the picture the boy had drawn again and again of the father in his imagination, thought of all the long nights the boy had dreamed of a father who would come back, and now that father was sitting right beside him. Unable to hold it back any longer, tears rolled down the hard man's cheeks. For the first time in his entire life, Damon Kessler cried, not from pain or loss, but from an overwhelming emotion that burst open inside him and could not be put into words. He gave a slight nod, and in a trembling, choked voice, he told his son, "Yes, Daddy is your daddy. Daddy has come back, and Daddy will never leave you again." Micah stared at him for a long while, his round eyes seeming to try to understand the full meaning of those words. Then the little boy, with the innocence and endless forgiveness of a child's soul, slowly reached out his tiny hand, placed it on Damon's large hand, and held on. That small hand clasp, warm and trusting, like an acceptance, like the first tender beginning of forgiveness, made Damon's heart break open with happiness and remorse all at once. He gently pulled his son into his arms, holding tightly the child he had lost for 6 years. And in that moment, he silently promised himself that he would spend the rest of his life loving him and making up for everything, so that not one more lonely tear would ever fall inside the small house again. From inside the house, Rosie stood quietly watching father and son, her own eyes blurring, and for the first time after all those years, a gentle smile softly bloomed on her lips. Time passed quietly, and life in the little house was gradually warmed by simple, honest things. Damon and Rosie didn't rush to mend everything in a single morning or evening, because both of them understood that deep wounds needed time to heal. There was no swift reunion, no hurried promises, only the patience of a man determined to atone and the slow opening of a woman who had been wounded for far too long. Day by day, they learned how to trust each other again, learned how to build a home from the broken pieces of the past, and between them, the love from years ago, though once stolen, was quietly coming back to life, fragile yet persistent like a green shoot rising after a freezing winter. As for Eleanor, the mother who had helped bring about that tragedy with her own hands, Damon didn't send her away to some distant exile, but but she no longer held the same position or authority she once had. She lived quietly in a hidden corner of her own life, carrying the weight of what she had done. One afternoon, she stood far away, silently looking through a window at the sight of Damon and his son laughing together, looking at the grandson she had never once dared to acknowledge. In those aged eyes, a belated regret appeared for a fleeting moment, a remorse too deep to put into words, a repentance that would perhaps follow her to the end of her life. She wasn't fully forgiven, and perhaps she herself understood that she didn't deserve such a thing. But in that moment, as she watched the happiness of her child and grandchild from the other side of the window, there was still something deeply human in her. The pain of a mother who had finally realized the terrible price greed had made her pay. The story of Damon and Rosie closed in that way, not with a perfect fairy tale ending, but with a truthful and warm hope for the days ahead. And hidden behind that story is a message each of us can carry with us through our own lives. That a person's dignity never lies in the status or wealth they possess, but in the heart they carry and the way they treat the world. That true strength doesn't belong to those who have the power to trample others, but to those who know how to use their strength to protect the vulnerable, and who have the courage to face and correct their own mistakes. And that kindness, compassion, and quiet sacrifices, no matter how long they may be buried and forgotten by life, will in the end still be seen, and will still be repaid in a worthy way. Because in this world no sincerity is ever wasted, and no true love ever fails to find its way back home. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so we can listen together to many more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about the journey of Damon, Rosie, and little Micah, and what part of the story moved you the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we're always hoping to hear the sincere feelings that come from the bottom of your heart. Thank you for spending your time with us until the very last moments. May you and the people you love always be blessed with good health, and may you live a joyful, peaceful life filled with love every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.